Welcome back to the Ripewave audio community, where we explore together all types of home audio systems from hi-fi to home theater. My name is John, and for this video we will continue to optimize audio settings for music with the Sony UBP X1100ES Ultra High Definition Universal Blu-ray player. This time I was able to borrow a more modern AV processor with HDMI inputs, so we can test out additional settings within this UHD player. If you missed the earlier content, check out the previous video, Sony UBP X1100ES, Audio Optimization for Music Playback, which is part 1 in this optimization series. Also available are other Ripewave Audio UHD player videos entitled Shopping for a UHD Player, Parts 1 and 2, and Sony UBP X1100ES First Impressions. I have provided links and a playlist to those for your convenience. In the previous video, we focused on connectivity to a vintage Sony TAE 9000ES processor, which has no HDMI inputs and is limited to 48 kHz digital signals sent over coax or optical cable. With those limitations, I found the following setup of the UHD player to provide the best results. Setting digital output to auto, downmix to surround, PCM to 48 kHz, DSEE HX to on, and DSD output mode, BD secondary audio, DTS Neo 6, audio DRC or dynamic range compression, all set to off. Given the limitations of my Sony processor, I was unable to successfully configure DTS Neo 6, upscaling, SACD multi-channel output, and sampling beyond 48 kHz. Since then, I was able to borrow my mom's Emotiva UMC 200 processor, which not only has HDMI input, it also has an internal DAC capable of handling the maximum 24-bit 192 kHz sampling rate of the player. The UMC listed for $599 and was actively sold roughly between 2013 and 2016, and was subsequently replaced with a similar model, the MC700. It was well regarded for its capability at this price point. To hook up the UMC 200 via HDMI, I referred to the player's manual, which gave 3 options for hookup. 1. 4K soundbar or AV amplifier receiver with HDMI inputs. 2. Non-4K soundbar or AV amplifier receiver with HDMI inputs. Or 3. A non-4K soundbar AV amplifier receiver without HDMI inputs. In this case, I'm moving from option 3, which was used in the previous video, to option 2. As the UMC 200 is not 4K capable, option 1 is not an option. This configuration involved running an HDMI cable from HDMI 2 of the UHD player to the UMC 200. Keep in mind that HDMI 2 on these players is reserved for audio-only output. I chose HDMI input 1 on the UMC 200. I maintained the same connection between the player and the TV using the player's first HDMI output, which has both video and audio. I also ran the HDMI cable from the UMC 200's HDMI output, which supports ARC, to another TV input. Knowing that the UMC 200 supports 192 kHz signals, I began this set of tests by reconfiguring the player to remove the 48 kHz limit on its digital outputs. I decided to keep things simple at first with a test of the CD playback before attempting multi-channel sources. As DSEE HX was enabled from my previous session, CD playback displayed on the UMC 200 as PCM 88.2 kHz. This reveals that the DSEE HX technology is doubling the sampling rate. Please note that for this optimization exercise, I am focusing on achieving the best functional configuration based on specifications without conducting full listening tests. I will leave more critical listening comparisons to determine if there is an audible difference for another day. Next, I tried the DTS Neo 6 upscaler of the player. The Emotiva has 7 discrete channels of outputs, which is 2 more than my Sony processor. So this will be interesting for me. Turning on DTS Neo 6 resulted in the player disabling the DSEE HX upsampling, as you cannot upsample and upchannel at the same time within the player. Now the UMC 200 reported PCM multi at 44.1 kHz and displayed the available channels as left, center, right, left surround, left rear surround, and right rear surround. And I could hear distinct outputs through each of the surround and rear surround speakers. As the UMC 200 also has a DTS Neo 6 sound mode, I was able to enjoy upsampling and upchanneling simultaneously. For this, I disabled DTS Neo 6 on the player and enabled DSEE HX on the player and DTS Neo 6 on the processor. As someone who prefers multi-channel, I can appreciate this workaround. Next, I moved on to multi-channel disc formats. Since the last video, I remembered having the Fleetwood Mac Mirage Deluxe Edition, which includes 1 disc with a 5.1 mix. Instead of it being a DVD audio disc, this one is an audio-only DVD video, which makes this playable on units without support for DVD audio. There is 3 options for playback from the disc's main menu: DTS Surround, Dolby Surround, or PCM channel. I started with the default of DTS Surround, and the UMC 200 reported 96 kHz DTS 3.2 plus LFE. Switching to Dolby on the menu, the UMC 200 displayed Dolby Digital 48 kHz 3.2 plus LFE, and the PCM stereo came in at PCM 96K 2-channel. I then loaded one of my Chicago Blu-ray Pure Audio quadraphonic discs. This time I selected Chicago 10. Unlike the experience with the Sony processor, the HDMI output of the player now displays a 4-channel output and not 2-channel as with the coax-based setup. On the Emotiva, we see DTS HD Master Audio 192K 2x2 or 2.0 if the 2-channel program is selected on the disc. This was the first example of receiving the full 192K signal that the player and UMC 200 are both capable of supporting. For this set of tests, I also popped in Pink Floyd's The Endless River on Blu-ray Pure Audio disc. The playback of this disc defaults to 2-channel playback. The UMC 200 correctly identifies it as a PCM 96 kHz 2-channel source. I push the audio button on the player's remote to switch to language 2, English, DTS HD audio 5.1 channel 96 kHz. This output value was mirrored on both the HDMI output of the player and input of the processor, with the display showing DTS HD Master Audio 192 kHz 3.2 LFE. The third language is English LPCM, or Linear Pulse Code Modulation, 5.1 96 kHz 24-bit, which requires the decoder of the player to do the work. As a result, the UMC 200 reports the signals it receives as multi-PCM 96K 3.2 plus LFE. With Blu-ray being a success, on to Super Audio using the Elton John SACD sampler. Here it is important to keep the DSD output mode set to off. Even though the UMC 200 has HDMI inputs, it is not capable of processing DSD sources and requires them to be converted to PCM first. When all is good, the UMC 200 reports the signal as multi-PCM 176.4K 3.2 plus LFE. However, it took me a while to sort out the configuration of the UMC 200 as well as the cabling. There are issues that are discussed on Emotiva's Lounge community site with SACD playback challenges being common. Only with SACD did I suspect the quality of the HDMI cables to be an issue. I swapped out among several HDMI cables until I found one that appears to work better, but I'm not completely sure. The other common cause of SACD playback failure is when the HDMI control settings cause a conflict. This is due to the copy protection that is in place with SACD. Even when using the supported HDMI interface, it is possible for control signals to be confused with the protection mechanism and disrupt playback. I took a broad brush approach to the HDMI issue by disabling the HDMI control altogether. I went into the system settings for the player and changed the HDMI settings so the control for HDMI was set to off. I made similar changes on the processor and turning off CEC control and setting the HDMI audio out to amplifier. After which, it worked on occasion, and I am still trying to make sense of it so I can get it to work repeatedly. I even tried another SACD, such as my Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon 5.1 Super Audio CD, but it still had similar issues. I certainly prefer the experience with the Blu-ray Pure Audio discs over that I am getting with Super Audio. With the formats and features tested, which mostly provided positive results, I decided to conduct a few comparative tests. I was curious how the coax interface of the Emotiva compared with its HDMI input I tested earlier. When I connected the player to the processor using coax, SACD playback over coax was limited to 44.1K as expected due to the copy protection limitation. But with a compact disc, I got a full upsampled 88.2 kHz signal as with the HDMI interface. My last comparison had nothing to do with the UHD player, but rather how the vintage Sony TAE9000ES was going to hold up against the Emotiva UMC 200 with over a decade of technological advancement in its favor. As I am to return the UMC 2000 back to my mom tomorrow, and my wiring was already all messed up, it was a good time to address this nagging question. For this, I kept it simple, with a 2-channel comparison running through my LSIM703 speakers. The Sony TAN9000ES 5-channel amplifier provided the power and made A/B switching between the two processors with its extra set of 2-channel inputs and selector switch. I balanced the volume with a sound pressure meter to make the comparison as fair as possible without a formal test. My first impression was that the vintage Sony was the clear winner, as its sound was warmer, less harsh on the top end, its bass more resounding, and its overall characteristic fuller. However, after longer listening periods, the Emotiva grew on me, and I started to appreciate its handling of the mid-range and upper end as potentially more neutral. The two processors had different signatures, and perhaps each had its own merits. While the Emotiva is a worthy competitor, I'm not running to it. That feeling has to do with the whole experience, with my number one issue being the lack of a solid volume knob. With part 2 complete of this optimization, we have covered a lot of use cases. Certainly, I can say now that HDMI is my favorite source interface, and the need for coax and optical inputs will likely fade and be relegated to legacy support in the future. If an HDMI interface is available on your processor, it's certainly worth consideration. SACD playback is challenging, at least for me. Perhaps a processor that directly supports DSD would be an improvement. What remains unexplored are the object-based sound formats, Atmos, DTS:X, and Aural 3D. I will keep that on my long-range plans. If you also own a Sony X1100ES, I would be interested in hearing your feedback. Perhaps include in the comments section, are you coming up with the same conclusions? Do you have some favorite setup tips you'd like to share? That feedback would be useful to the Ripewave audio community. Furthermore, if you enjoyed this video and are interested in enhancing your audio experience, please like and subscribe to this Ripewave audio community, and be sure to select the bell icon so you'll be notified as soon as the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.